Hey there, welcome. This is Lee Thurburn, and you've joined Livestream Lee on Monday, the 10th of May. And I want to welcome you to our show. So today we have a special guest, Dr. Michael Armour, and he is a specialist in a number of things, including political analysis. No, let me rephrase that. He's an expert in early Middle Ages. Um, I'm not quite sure I'm going to say this correctly. He's going to correct me in a moment, but he studied this 13th to the 15th century European history because that was a time of transition. And as a result, he has a unique insight into certain parallels with the world that we live in now with the advent of the internet and the kind of transformation that society is going through now. So he's got some particularly interesting insights, especially when you couple his background there with his 35 years of service to the United States as a member of the U.S. Navy. And so in addition to being a very educated and talented business leader. He also teaches leadership. I know I've just butchered his introduction, and I apologize, Mike, for that. But before we get started, I just want to mention this is a different kind of show than I've done before because we're going to be talking about something today that Mike and I had a conversation about that I think is fascinating. And Mike has, I think, some particular insights into because of his time with the Navy and the studies that he engaged in to get his PhD. And that is China and the threat that China represents to the United States in a number of respects, both economically, politically, culturally, and militarily. So we're going to get to that in just a moment because this is something that I think not enough businesses have spent enough time thinking about. Before we get there, I want to just make sure that I cover a couple of things. First of all, my whole purpose in doing the Livestream Lee show is to help businesses become more successful and to have businesses and help businesses think about how to grow their businesses more quickly. And my whole purpose in life as a businessman myself is to help businesses grow faster. We do that largely through the technology that I've developed, which is called Apricot Rocket. And I'd like to invite you to go to apricotrocket.com and create an account. Our goal with Apricot Rocket is to help you get customers, to grow faster, to be more profitable. And so I'd like to invite you to do that. I also want to say that one of the things that I know happens in business is the unexpected. The unexpected is the worst thing that can happen to you because you quite literally are never prepared for it. So there's a guy that I want to introduce you to. His name is Carlos Cantu. And Carlos is in the risk management business. And I have known Carlos for a long time, and I routinely call Carlos to talk with him about things that I think might come up. I try new ventures, run new ideas by him, and Carlos helps me think of the risks that I haven't thought about so that I'm well prepared to think about them. And so go to livestreamlee.com, and on the right-hand side of the page, you'll see a series of buttons. One of them says Carlos Cantu. If you don't have a risk management specialist working for you in your business, that's an area that you need to have somebody that you trust. And Carlos is a good guy, so click on the Carlos Cantu button and get in touch with Carlos. Now, risk management is actually one of the things we're going to talk about today. As I've already mentioned, the United States and China, I think, are headed towards an interesting political and military situation vis-a-vis the two. So I'm just going to go ahead and add Mike to the stream. Mike, thank you for being available and joining me today. We had a couple of wonderful conversations in the last week or so.
Yes, we did.
And before I go any farther, let you please correct my introduction of you. you know, you've had a gifted career. Among other things, you've been, well, just introduce yourself, please, Mike.
I've been here in Dallas since about 1986 and currently have a leadership development firm, which I began in 2001. But prior to that, I've been in a lot of different roles. Lee mentioned 35 years of active duty and reserve experience in the Navy, most of that time in the naval intelligence community. I've also been the CEO of an international humanitarian organization doing a lot of work in Eastern Europe and across Asiatic Russia. I've, in addition to that, founded one school, been president of a college, dean of students at a university. So quite a diverse background. And I particularly am interested in times of cultural change throughout history. And that's really what Lee was alluding to when he was introducing me a moment ago. I spent a lot of time early in my graduate career studying ancient and medieval history. And then for the final phase of it, moved into the transition from the agrarian era to the industrial era that marked the 14th to the 17th centuries. And the reason I did that is that when I began doctoral work in 1980, I was very much aware of what was happening in the world of high tech, where computers were taking us. And I could see this shift from the industrial era to the information age was going to be the most dramatic humanity had ever been through, except the shift from the agrarian age to the industrial age. And so I decided to focus in that period of transition in Europe, where the documents are easy for me to access because they're in languages I'm familiar with, and they're pretty well preserved, to study that period in order to understand the kinds of transitions cultures and civilizations go through when they make the kind of transition that we are now in the midst of as the information age takes root.
Mike, thank you for patching my my very inadequate introduction of you. I will just, in my own defense, say I'm so excited to be able to visit with somebody like yourself with your breadth of knowledge, and I am personally extremely infatuated with the time that you spent in the Navy and your working in the intelligence community, because my dad was an intelligence officer aboard the Kearsarge during the which was an aircraft carrier, an old I guess diesel aircraft carrier in the Korean War, and he flew missions, but mostly coordinated collecting photographs from photo reconnaissance missions and making sure they got packed off back to Washington for analysis. And you know, he and I had a lot of conversations as a kid. I thought, you know, wow, this Navy officer, you know, just you know, collecting sensitive information and stuff like that. I thought it was fascinating. And so when we were talking earlier this week, and you mentioned that, I just my antenna just went off. And now, without ever, of course, asking you to convey anything that you shouldn't, and we all know that there's still stuff that you've been involved in that you can't talk about, I brought up the subject of, personally, I'm quite concerned. I got to say, I don't want to be a Chicken Little or an alarmist here, but I'm quite concerned with the trend that we have, I think, seen unfolding with China and where I think it's headed. And I mentioned something to the effect that I thought we're headed in a few years, and I do mean few, towards a military conflict with China over the Spratly Islands, for the simple reason that they claim them as theirs, and you can't claim something as yours for very long and have it be respected as a legitimate claim unless you enforce that claim.
Right.
And I see a likelihood of them enforcing that claim coming up fairly soon. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. And I think you have some unique insight there. So before we jump into it, I thought I would just put a graphic up of, and it's going to kind of cover our faces a little bit, so you might want to scoot to one side or the other. But
Okay, here we go.
there you go.
There
So
we go. Okay, now
so
I'm with you.
so just go ahead and kind of take it from there. And do you share the same concern? And if so, why? And kind of where do you see it going? Let's just talk about that.
Well, that whole area through there is a region of concern because of a larger strategy that China is openly and unapologetically pursuing, which is basically to find a way to minimize the chokehold that someone in a time of war, particularly India, would have on the Straits of Malacca. Now, for our people who may not be familiar with the geography of that part of the area, the Straits of Malacca is that narrow body of water you see just south of Malaysia there. 70% of China's oil goes through the Straits of Malacca. 80% of the commerce in that part of the world goes through the Straits of Malacca. Because of the way the islands south of there are distributed, and because of the depths of the waters around those islands, large ships really have very few options except to go through those straits or spend days making a circumnavigation of areas that are not really appropriate for them. Look at where the Spratlys are. They're right in a choke point between the South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca. India in the past has threatened to close the Straits of Malacca because China has been what one person in an Indian article, an article authored by an Indian I read recently called Pakistan's all-weather friend. China has been there to help Pakistan many a time. And when India and Pakistan have gone at one another militarily or threatened to, China has always come immediately to Pakistan's side. And when they do, India threatens to close the Straits of Malacca, and they've got the Navy to do it. And so this is a very pivotal area for both India and China. And the Spratlys, which were contested back in the days of the Second World War. I did a master's thesis on U.S. And European relations with Indochina up to the Dien Bien Phu, beginning in about 1932 with the Shanghai Revolution in China, and coming up to the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And in the midst of all that period of time, the Spratlys were contested. There's not much there of any value other than location. But if you can have a military presence there, reinforced by a sizable and formidable Navy, it is a very strategic place to have. And for the future, I think China's got its eyes on it.
So I think if you look at the map, you don't really see a couple of other things that are kind of important. One is the closeness of India, because it's really just about where my face is.
Yep,
currently.
That's right.
So India is pretty doggone close. And then the second thing is you don't see the size of the Pacific Ocean, which is huge. It not only is where your face is, but it's like another layer or two off to the right.
Right.
And while we have a significant Navy, we have a Navy that's spread out across a much larger area than that confined space. And you hear a lot of people talk about the fact that the U.S. military and the U.S. Navy is so much vastly more potent and more advanced than China. But what you may not really think about a lot is the fact that while they have a less powerful Navy, it's focused in a much more sort of concentrated space, which is a sort of a counterbalancing factor, at least to some degree, along with the fact that they're literally building stationary aircraft carriers in the form of the islands, which essentially can't be sunk unless you hit them with a nuclear weapon, which takes them away, and that's a whole different kind of conversation. So I thought I would just show up for a brief moment in time, a graphic here that I'm going to have to move this one down. And I don't know if y'all can see this graphic, but in case it's not as large as I'd like it to be, let me see if I can't. Yeah, maybe I can make this a little bit larger. There we go. Let's see if, did that get a little bit larger?
Yes, that's very good.
Okay, so at this point now you can see that China has about 714 total assets, of which one is an aircraft carrier. The United States, of course, has way more aircraft carriers and, generally speaking, a much more advanced Navy. But the important thing to keep in mind is we're concerned with an entire, all the oceans of the world, and we're not trying to focus all of our Navy in one small area. And they have, again, half a dozen islands at this point that operate as aircraft carriers, so to speak, which make it potentially a very even playing field. And that's kind of what they're counting on. So you mentioned the other day another, I want to toss another wild card in here. I had not thought about this, but you said that China may very well have other intentions other than just to the south in the South China Sea. You had spent some time in central Russian Siberian provinces and made an interesting observation. Would you share what that was?
Well, I share your bias that China's primary focus right now is the Indian Ocean. And it's because their economy has grown so much in the last 10 to 20 years. And there is now a level of prosperity in China under the new strange admixture they're creating of communism and elements of capitalism. Enough people have prospered under that there is a great demand for goods and shall we say, a higher standard of living among the Chinese people. To satisfy that, they've got to have energy. And though they have limited offshore oil and some oil reserves, their energy comes from the Middle East. And without it, everything comes to a halt pretty quickly for the Chinese economy. So their primary goal has to be the areas around the Indian Ocean over to the Arabian Sea, that region, the Persian Gulf. But I think in the back of their minds, longer range, and the Chinese have always thought longer range, there is the opportunity that lies just north of them in Siberia. Because unbeknownst to a lot of us here in America, Siberia is the largest concentration of untapped natural resources in the world. And that has to do with strategic metals, it has to do with forests, it has to do with a whole host of classifications of materials that are extremely important for any thriving industrial power. China and Russia have historically had points of tension. At times they've tried to ally themselves. The alliance, even under Marxism in Russia, didn't hold together very well because they are different kinds of people with different interests and different outlooks. But I think there is a very distinct possibility that however what we're talking about today plays out, we're going to see increasing efforts by China to use its economic might and Russia's economic struggle as an opportunity to start establishing more significant outposts in Siberia with an eye to one day having an opportunity to perhaps have control of that area. Now, they don't have to do it necessarily militarily. It can simply be an economic dominance that plays to their advantage. So when I am in Novosibirsk and walking the streets around the universities, and there are great universities in Novosibirsk, there are Chinese students everywhere. A friend of mine for a number of years, a Russian educator himself, spent the bulk of his time in the latter years of his life teaching Russian to Chinese students who were there for graduate work. So I think that's also something we'll want to watch for in the future, not necessarily immediately, because the immediate issue for China is the Indian Ocean and control of its oil routes.
Right. So we have a short term and a midterm and maybe even a long term play. The short term is to ensure access to petrochemical resources coming from the Middle East to keep the energy flowing into their economy. The midterm is to establish a more dominant geopolitical position throughout that part of the world. And the long term is to secure northern border access to resources, preferably through strategic alliances and economic relationships, but possibly, if that fails, then a stronger China becomes a greater threat to Russia. And, obviously, I think the Russians, certainly aren't stupid people. They see that as well.
Right.
So, but I really enjoyed hearing that aspect of it that I had not thought about in particular. So when I broached this subject with you, because of the way that they are rapidly, aggressively building out the military fortifications on the Spratly Islands, the increasing level of threat sounds that they're making to U.S. freedom of navigation exercises in the area, the escalating level of encroachment in terms of airspace violations over the Taiwan airspace, it seems to me that China is pushing relatively quickly towards a position where they can prove that we can't stop them. And when I recently saw three very interesting, I think it's Polymatter, which is a guy that does a lot of statistical data analysis on YouTube. And he's done some very, very thoughtful analysis of the Chinese housing market collapse, the demographic collapse, and a couple of other things that are very interesting that basically point to a sense of urgency that China has to establish this dominance. And there's a certain sort of coalescing or convergence of population and economic factors or forces that may very well be requiring the Communist Party to deliver currently, not in the future, but currently on their promise of a better life.
Right.
And that time frame is probably within 10 years. And I'm thinking that we may very well be looking at a conflagration of some sort. It may not be China shooting at one of our planes or one of our boats, but there's plenty of other players in the area. So if I put this other slide back up, you can easily see that the Philippines and Vietnam and a number of other countries that also lay claims to those islands could very well be the subject of a Chinese missile or, some other aggressive act. What is that going to do? First of all, do you think that's likely to occur? Is 5 years a reasonable time frame? 10 years? I mean, I guess there's sort of two questions here. Do you think it's almost inevitable that that's going to happen? And if so, what is your time frame for thinking that we're going to see something of that nature?
I would think if, and I have no inside nor privileged knowledge on this, but this just comes from my interest in strategy and geopolitical considerations that shape foreign policy for countries. And I've been studying that for years. My sense is it's most likely to come in 5 to 10 years if it comes. And here's the reason. India has the ability to make things pretty miserable for China in the Straits of Malacca. And I keep coming back to that. We've got to keep in mind that we've got an ally in India that we do not always recognize the importance of as just run-of-the-mill Americans. Because the Indians do not want communist Chinese domination of Asia any more than they already have, because the Indians not only feel that the Chinese are trying to encircle them, and we could talk about that encirclement strategy because it seems to be occurring in the military and economic fronts. We never must forget that India is one of the most religious regions of the world. The people of India are extremely religious, a lot of religious diversity, a lot of very different kinds of religions, and they have hostilities at times between those various religious groups. But they're sitting just south of Tibet. They know what the Chinese communists did to the Tibetan Buddhists. They know what the communist Chinese are doing in the southwestern provinces right now to the Uyghurs. They, from just the deep commitment they have to spiritual and religious things, see China as not just an economic threat or a military threat, but a cultural threat. And therefore, when you study the Indian press, they're putting a lot of thought into how they thwart this Chinese muscle flexing that's going on. One of the things that would happen if the Chinese began to create nervousness in this area that you've highlighted by seeming to get aggressive and positioning themselves where they would be closer to having a short range influence on the Straits of Malacca and Indian efforts to block trade going to or from China through there. They're going to be very cautious about that. Now, that's where I come with the 5 to 10 years. China is right now building an oil line that will go north of India and come down through Pakistan and out onto the ocean there. It will be a very large capacity oil line. And it will take a lot of the pressure off of depending upon the Straits of Malacca in order to move their oil. And I think until they've got that safety valve to fall back on, they're probably going to be a little calculating and cautious about voting that would cost them the easy transport through the Straits of Malacca. And that's just my read on it. But the timetable is about 5 years for the completion of that oil line, if all goes on the present schedule. And I think that's going to be a key to any timetable that the Chinese might choose.
So it's don't rock the boat until you have a backup plan. And
Right.
then once you have a backup plan, you then have, and this is from the energy independence perspective, once you have the backup plan in place, that frees you up to be more stalwart and aggressive in the defense of your claimed ownership of the land, the islands.
Right.
So that's why you think somewhere between 5 and 10 years, not within the next 5 years, is a more likely time frame.
Yes, and the thing that we've not talked about today, it's perhaps a topic for some other discussion. If you study what China has been doing for the last 15 years, they have been establishing strategic, potentially military strongholds at every choke point for trade. They've been doing it in Panama. Only within the last 2 years of the Trump administration did we finally get the Panamanians to reject some major Chinese efforts to build large infrastructure projects there and have, in effect, control of major elements of the logistic system in Panama. They are doing the same thing around the mouth of the Red Sea. They're doing the same thing at other places where trade is funneled because of straits or canals such as the Suez and the Panama. And what we are seeing in Africa, where I also have spent a lot of time, I had a subsidiary there for a while. What we're seeing there and what we're seeing through other parts of the world is the Chinese come in and they loan you the money to build some infrastructure you need. In the case of Kenya, it was a standard gauge railroad. They then take as collateral some strategically important asset like an airport or a port. In the case of Kenya, it was the port of Mombasa, many of the assets there. As recently as last month, I saw an article in the African press in which the Kenyan government was arguing that the production of the seizure of Mombasa for failure to honor the loan was not likely, but it's still a working concern. And there are audit reports that say that China has a claim to major assets at the port of Mombasa if they default on that loan. What they do is they loan more money than they think the country can repay. They take a strategic asset. When the country defaults, they seize that asset. They've got that game plan going all around the Horn of Africa, across into the Central Asia. And that's why India is starting to feel surrounded, with the Chinese creating an oil route north of them and controlling the choke points west of them in the Indian Ocean, and then the struggle that you've been talking about at the Spratlys. This seems to be their strategy of getting in a position where they have economic and military muscle at every choke point in trade in that part of the world.
So the premise that I wanted to discuss, we've actually kind of run out of time, so I think we're going to have to do this again. But the premise I wanted to discuss was what can and should U.S. companies do to prepare for the gradual and maybe potentially dramatically sort of instantaneous. I mean, if 5 years or 6 years from now, China happens to throw a missile or a bullet at an airplane that is either a U.S. plane or an ally's plane, that is a significant aggressive act that will require the United States to get involved in, something that could end up costing us quite a bit of treasure. And when that happens, and I think it's more likely to be a when rather than an if, but when and if that happens, supply chains with China and with that part of the world are going to be extremely threatened. So what are the things that companies in the United States can and should do to protect their wealth, their supply chains, and so forth? And we're not going to have time to really go down that path. So maybe we can schedule, I don't know, next week, come back and talk about this, because that's a conversation that I think is an interesting one, and that can be win. I think the Chinese may have hacked us. I'm only kidding. Anyway, let's schedule a time.
Can I just add one footnote to today's conversation, Lee, right quick? We didn't get to really comment about those Navy comparisons a while ago. One of the things that I want to highlight, it makes a real difference strategically, is that we have built what is called a blue water navy, a blue ocean navy. The Chinese have lots of vessels, but they're made for close-in operations.
Right.
Even their one carrier is a jump carrier, and those have limitations that are imposed on the aircraft in terms of fuel and payload, therefore range and throw weight. Right. As a result, when you look at what they're doing, they're building for close-in combat, close to where they've got physical support from land-based assets. So that's why your comments about the Spratly are particularly relevant.
Yeah, they literally, I think, have built a navy specifically for a Taiwan invasion and a Spratly Islands supported range. In other words, being able to range close to island bases. But yeah, let's talk more about that as well. So I'm going to get together with you afterwards and schedule another time if you'd like, and we'll just carry this conversation on. Mike, thank you for your time today. I've really enjoyed this, and hopefully people have also likewise enjoyed it. It's a conversation that has a lot of legs on it.
Yes, it does. It does.
Mike, I'm going to put you back in the waiting room and wrap it up. So I'll talk to you in a moment. Folks, if this was an interesting conversation for you, if these kinds of topics interest you, then you're probably somebody that is a fan and interested in history. And there's a guy that I keep talking about that I just think he's got some of the most fascinating stories. If you're like me and enjoy interesting stories about historical figures, you want to go to livestreamly.com and find the link for Dan Nelson. He's a genealogist. He is also a master storyteller, and he's got a newsletter that he sends out every couple of weeks. And it's one of the most interesting reads you're going to get in your inbox. He just has great content. It's not necessarily stuff that he finds when he's researching a specific family's background, but in the process, he just runs across so much stuff that it's always popping up with some new interesting historical trivia that it's just fun to read about. So if you like that kind of stuff, go to livestreamly.com, find the link for Dan Nelson, click on it, and go sign up for his newsletter. If you don't like his newsletter, you can always unsubscribe, but it is a fun read. I'm just going to tell you that. In the meantime, go to apricotrocket.com, click on the Join Us link, create an account. If you do, and if you're looking for customers, I'll guarantee you that we can get you customers. All you got to do is create an account, play around with it, and then if you have any questions, give me a call. You'll find my phone number. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back tomorrow for Thursday and or for Tuesday and Wednesday of this week. We're going to be talking about marketing. On Thursday of this week, we have another topic that I think you might find interesting, and the topic is social justice in the boardroom. Now, if you don't know what social justice is, I'm going to unpack that and make sure you understand what it is. It is actually Karl Marx reinvented. And if you don't know what that's all about, tune in on Thursday for the topic of does social justice belong in the boardroom? And that'll be another fun conversation. And then on Friday of this week, we're interviewing somebody near and dear to my heart, Julie Thurburn, who is a personal image consultant. And we're going to talk with her about how she makes you more attractive. And I don't just mean better looking. I mean attractive to business, which is what her whole focus is. So if you want to attract more business, tune in on Friday and hear what Julie has to say. All right, that's it for today. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 o'clock.